September 13th, 1944. Fort Driant, outside Metz, France, on the bluff above the Moselle River, whose height gives the fort its command of the valley below, and whose elevation makes it visible for miles in every direction, and makes the fort visible to the American artillery forward observers, who have been registering their guns on it since the Tenix Corps' first contact with the Metz defensive ring on September 5. The German garrison commander inside the fort's casemate is listening to American 8-inch howitzer rounds impacting the structure above him, listening with the specific and professional attention of a soldier who is trying to determine, from the sound and the vibration and the dust falling from the casemate ceiling, whether the structure is holding. It is holding. And he is realizing, for the first time, that the fort he is defending cannot protect him in the way he thought it could. Fort Driant is not a weak position. It is one of the most formidable fixed fortifications in Western Europe, a 19th century French-built defensive work whose original construction between 1902 and 1912 incorporated the concrete thicknesses and the earthen revetment depths that the French military engineering tradition identified as sufficient protection against the heaviest field artillery of the Edwardian period, and whose subsequent German occupation and improvement since 1940 has added the communications infrastructure, the ammunition storage upgrades, and the defensive wire and obstacle belts that the Second World War's tactical requirements have made standard in fortified positions throughout the European theater. Its interlocking fields of fire cover the approaches from the Moselle River Valley below with the systematic coverage that 19th century fortress engineers built into their designs as the primary mechanism for the fort's ground defense, coverage whose execution requires the garrison's weapons to function and whose function depends on the garrison remaining operationally capable inside the fort's protective concrete. The garrison of approximately 1,000 men is positioned behind the meters of concrete and earthen revetment that the fort's designers calculated in 1902 as sufficient to protect a garrison against the heaviest available artillery fire. The calculation was correct in 1902. The concrete thicknesses that the French military engineers specified for Fort Driant's construction were calculated against the artillery of the period. The heaviest siege guns available in 1902, firing the heaviest shells that the early 20th century's metallurgy and propellant chemistry could produce, at the rates that early 20th century ammunition production could sustain for the duration of a siege. The calculation was correct for the threat it was designed against. In September 1944, the American Text Corps, under General Walton Walker, has artillery whose caliber and whose destructive effect the 1902 designers did not include in their calculation. Did not include because the weapons did not exist in 1902 and could not have been projected as existing by 1944 without the specific and unprojectable developments in metallurgy, propellant chemistry, and industrial production that 4 decades of technological progress have produced. The 8-inch howitzers round that is impacting the casemate above the garrison commander in September 1944 is a different instrument from the heaviest round that the 1902 calculation anticipated, and the garrison commander listening to it is experiencing the specific and professional realization that the fort's protective calculation is obsolete. Not defeated, not penetrated. Obsolete in the specific sense that the engineering calculation that built this fort has been superseded not by better artillery in the qualitative sense, but by the specific and historically unprecedented combination of artillery capability and industrial sustainment capacity that the American military in 1944 represents. The concrete above him is not breached. The garrison is not dead. The ammunition in the fort's magazines is not yet exhausted. But the psychological and tactical environment inside Fort Driant under American heavy artillery fire is producing in the garrison the effects that the designer's calculation was supposed to prevent. Effects that the calculation did not project because the calculation was made by engineers who understood the physics of artillery and concrete and did not have data for the psychology of sustained, indefinite bombardment from artillery whose supply is operationally inexhaustible. The effects are real. The dust that the impacts shake from the casemate walls and the fine concrete particles that accumulate on every surface and in the lungs of the garrison soldiers over days and weeks of bombardment. The sound that the concrete transmits from the impact to the garrison's eardrums, despite the meters of protection between the detonation and the listeners, a sound that is not the same as the sound of an unprotected soldier hearing artillery nearby, but that is a continuous reminder of what is happening on the other side of the walls, and the specific and cumulative knowledge that the impacts will continue tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the week after that the artillery outside the wall is not a one-day event or a week-long preparatory bombardment, but an operational commitment whose sustaining capacity the American military's industrial supply system makes, for practical purposes, inexhaustible. The old fort is not useless because it cannot stop American artillery rounds from impacting its exterior. It is useless because it cannot stop American artillery from determining how long the garrison can endure. Metz is one of the oldest continuously garrisoned cities in Western Europe, a fact whose weight is visible in the layers of defensive architecture that surround it. The Roman walls, whose foundations underlie the medieval fortifications, the medieval towers, whose masonry gave way to the Renaissance bastions, the Renaissance bastions, whose geometry was superseded by the 17th century genius of Vauban. The Romans fortified it in the 1st century AD, because the Moselle crossing at Metz was the point that controlled movement along the route between the Rhine and the interior of Gaul. The Franks held it. The Holy Roman Empire contested it for generations in the complex jurisdictional struggles of medieval France and Germany. The French built their ring of defensive works around it in the 17th and 18th centuries, with Vauban's engineering principles, the bastion trace, the interlocking fields of fire, the principle of no dead ground near the walls, shaping the approach to the fortress city that controlled the Moselle River crossing and the road from France to Germany. The route that armies have been using to invade each other's territory since the Roman legions marched it, and that is still, in September 1944, the route that the Tenth Corps needs to move east toward the Siegfried Line and the German border. The Germans took Metz in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, held it for 47 years as the fortress city of the Reich's western frontier, and added their own ring of fortifications to the French ring already there. The Fest series of the German imperial period, massive concrete and steel emplacements built between the 1880s and 1912 on the higher ground around the city, supplementing the older French works with the 19th century's most advanced military engineering. The result is the layered defensive system whose outermost works, Fort Driant, Fort St. Blaise, Fort Verdun, Fort Coulou, Fort St. Privat, Fort Gambetta, and a dozen more, are the positions that General Walton Walker's Tenth Corps is beginning to engage in September 1944. The forts range from Vauban's 17th century earthwork constructions, whose bastion geometry is still visible in the ground plan of the inner works, to the massive concrete and steel emplacements of the German imperial period, whose construction in the 1880s and 1890s incorporated the most advanced military engineering of the late 19th century. The armor plate gun turrets, the concrete casemates whose depth the engineers calculated against the heaviest available siege artillery, the subterranean communications networks that allow the garrison to move between positions without surface exposure. 17 major forts in a ring roughly 5 miles from the city center at their closest and 8 miles at their farthest, a ring whose circumference spans approximately 40 miles of the Lorraine landscape and whose individual positions represent the concentrated military engineering intelligence of two European powers' fortress-building traditions applied to the same ground over 3 centuries and funded by the military appropriations of 2 nation-states whose security concerns have made Metz one of the most expensively fortified positions in the world. The German garrison defending Metz in September 1944 numbers approximately 14,000 men under General Heinrich Kittel, who has been given the specific and characteristically Nazi formulation of his mission: defend Metz to the last man. The formulation is not unique to Metz. It has been applied to every designated fortress city in the German defensive plan since Hitler issued the Festung Order in 1944, designating certain cities as fortresses whose defense to the last man and the last round is required regardless of tactical feasibility. Kittle is not a fanatic in the sense of a commander who has accepted the order without professional assessment of what it requires. He is a professional who has been given an order whose execution he will pursue with professional competence and professional calculation. He has read the assessments of the fort's defensive capability that the German Army's engineer staff has prepared, assessments that identify the fort's concrete thicknesses, their ammunition storage capacities, their water supplies, their communications infrastructure, and the specific and documented calculation of how long each fort's garrison can sustain operations under siege conditions. He has walked the positions personally in the first week of September, assessing the fields of fire, the condition of the obstacles, the state of the communications, and the morale of the garrison soldiers, whose professionalism varies across the formation's mix of regular infantry, replacement-heavy units, and the fortress troops whose specific training and specific psychological orientation is toward the siege defense that the Festung order requires. He has assessed what the forts can do and what they cannot do, and has formed the professional judgment that the ring of fortifications, while not adequate to stop a determined assault by a major American force, applied at full strength against a single position, can delay and impose costs sufficiently to make the reduction of Metz an extended operation that will consume Walker's corps for weeks rather than days. He is correct. What he has not fully assessed, what no German commander in September 1944 has fully assessed, because no German commander has yet directly experienced what American heavy artillery does to 19th century fort engineering over a period of sustained fire, is what the daily application of 8-inch howitzer rounds does to a fort's garrison over weeks rather than hours. General Walton Walker's Texas Corps in September 1944 is the Third Army's southernmost corps, operating in the Lorraine sector, where the autumn rains have been turning the fields to mud, and where the supply situation has been deteriorating since the Red Ball Express's fuel priority has been going to the armored formations pressing north and east, rather than to Walker's infantry-heavy corps pressing southeast toward Metz. Walker is a tanker by background and temperament, a commander who has known Patton since the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, and whose professional orientation reflects the same preference for aggressive advance that Patton has been institutionalizing as the Third Army's operational culture since August. Walker drives his corps hard, communicates his expectations bluntly, and has been producing the operational momentum that the Third Army's reputation depends on through the Lorraine campaign's difficult terrain and difficult weather. Metz is, for Walker, a tactical problem whose existence in the Texas Corps' operational area has been producing frustration since early September, when the leading elements of the 5th Infantry Division, under General Stafford Irwin, first reached the Moselle River, opposite the city, and found a defensive situation whose reduction would not yield to the direct assault that the operational tempo demands. The forts are there. The garrison is there. The fields of fire are there. The direct approach that worked in the open country west of the Moselle is not working in the fortified zone around Metz. The city is ringed by forts. The forts are occupied. The road network that the Texas Corps needs to use to continue its advance east passes through or around Metz. The fort's coverage of those roads makes them impassable without the reduction of the forts that cover them. Metz is not a bypassed obstacle. It is the operational center of gravity of the Texas Corps' sector. It must be reduced. The question that Walker's staff is working through in the first week of September 1944, as the Corps' operational focus shifts from pursuit to siege, is how American military capability translates into the reduction of a fortress city whose defensive architecture was built specifically to resist the military capabilities of the period that produced it. The forts were not built to resist modern American artillery, but no one has yet established, through the specific and definitive test of actually firing modern American artillery at a Metz fort, what that means for the fort's garrison. September 27, 1944. Fort Driant, Moselle River Valley, Texas sector. The 11th Infantry Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division begins the assault on Fort Driant that Walker has authorized following the Corps' assessment that direct assault is the fastest available method for the fort's reduction. The assessment built from the operational logic that an American infantry regiment with artillery support should be able to take a 19th century fort whose garrison, however determined, is fighting with the same physical limitations that any besieged garrison faces. The assessment is wrong in the specific and immediately costly way that military assessments are wrong when they are built from the wrong historical reference. Fort Driant does not fall quickly. It does not fall in September. The assault on September 27 produces some of the most costly and tactically frustrating combat of the entire Lorraine campaign. American infantry attacking a prepared fortified position across the open ground of the fort's glacis, whose approaches the surviving defenders can cover from the casemates and the fighting positions that the artillery preparation has suppressed but not destroyed. Advancing through the wire obstacles that the German garrison has been improving since their occupation of the fort, in the specific and terrible dynamic of a frontal assault on a fixed fortification where the defenders have the cover and the attackers have the open ground, and the dynamic between cover and exposure determines the casualty exchange rate in ways that favor the defenders with a systematic ruthlessness. The 11th Infantry Regiment loses men getting to the walls. The specific and costly process of crossing the open glacis under the fire of the garrison soldiers who are in their positions, in the fighting works and the casemates, firing from the cover that the fort's construction provides at the American infantry, in the open ground that the fort's construction exposes. It loses men getting over the walls and through the obstacles, and loses them in the specific and tragic way that assault infantry losses on fortified positions occur, concentrated at the obstacles and the breach points where the movement slows and the defender's fire is best. It establishes a position on the fort's surface and cannot expand it, because the German defenders in the casemates below can emerge from the covered internal stairways and the protected entrances that connect the casemate level to the surface level, and engage the American soldiers above through the trapdoors and the access points, whose locations the garrison knows, and the attackers are learning, at the cost of the men who find them occupied. The assault on Fort Driant in late September 1944 is the Tactical Corps' hardest fight, and its most instructive failure. Instructive because the failure reveals precisely what the forts can and cannot do against American military capability, and the instruction is paid for in the casualties that the assault produces. What the forts cannot do: they cannot prevent American artillery from firing. They cannot prevent American infantry from approaching. They cannot prevent the sustained American pressure that the Tactical Corps is able to maintain. What they can do: they can provide the garrison with protection from anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest available caliber, and they can provide the covered firing positions from which the German defenders engage the infantry assault in the unfavorable for the attacker engagement ratios that covered defensive fire always produces. The fort is not useless. It is formidable, but it is formidable in a way that delays rather than prevents, and the delay is what Kittle's mission requires. By October 3rd, Walker has ordered the withdrawal of the 11th Infantry from Fort Driant after a week of fighting that has established conclusively that the direct assault on the fort is not the operational method that will produce the result Walker needs in the timeline that the Tactical Corps' operational plan requires. The assault has failed in the specific sense that the regiment's objective, the fort's reduction and the elimination of its garrison as an operational threat, has not been achieved, and the cost of the continued attempt is not justified by the tactical progress that the attempt is producing. The Corps has lost several hundred men in the Fort Driant fighting, men whose loss the 5th Infantry Division's replacement situation cannot quickly offset, and whose sacrifice the operational outcome does not redeem. The fort has not fallen. The German garrison is still inside, still functioning, still occupying the casemates and the fighting positions that give it command of the Moselle Valley approaches, still capable of firing on the roads that the Tactical Corps needs to use for its eastward advance. Walker's assessment of the failure is direct and professional in the way that Walker's assessments have always been. The frontal assault on prepared fortifications is not the method whose application produces rapid results against Fort Driant's specific defensive arrangement. and the continued application of an ineffective method at increasing cost is not a professional military option. He has been correct about this since September 13th. Now he has the casualty count to confirm it. The method changes. The Corps shifts to encirclement and isolation. The 5th Infantry Division continuing to work around Metz's southern and western approaches, while the 90th Infantry Division under General James Van Fleet attacks from the north and east, completing the encirclement of the city that will make the question of the fort's resistance academic once the garrison's supply situation becomes untenable. The near failure in the XX Corps' Metz operation, the moment whose resolution determines whether Metz becomes a rapid reduction or a long siege, arrives on October 30 when Walker makes this decision, because the alternative is to continue the direct assault on Fort Driant and the other forts with the casualty rate that the September 27th assault has established as the cost of the direct approach. Walker chooses the encirclement. It is the correct choice. It is also the slower choice, and its slowness will mean that Metz does not fall until November 18th. The encirclement of Metz proceeds through October and into November, as the 5th Infantry Division works around the southern and western approaches, and the 90th Infantry Division under General James Van Fleet tightens the ring from the north and east. The methodical process of encirclement, whose completion will make the fort's continued resistance an exercise in delaying the inevitable, rather than achieving the strategic objective that their defense is supposed to enable. The artillery campaign that Walker's Corps artillery has been running against the fort positions since September does not stop during the encirclement. It intensifies, because the encirclement's completion allows the Corps artillery to concentrate on the forts that remain operational rather than covering the entire perimeter simultaneously. The 8-inch howitzers of the Corps artillery, the weapons that the garrison commanders have identified since September as the specific and most threatening element of the American artillery's effort, continue working on the fort positions whose garrison commanders have been sending to General Kittle's headquarters at Metz the specific and professional assessments of what the sustained artillery is doing to their position's operational capability. These assessments are preserved in the Foreign Military Studies post-war interview program that the American Army's historical section conducted with captured German officers in the years immediately following the war, and they are the primary source for the garrison commander's professional observations about the relationship between American artillery and 19th century fort engineering. The assessments are consistent across the different garrison commanders' reports. The fort's concrete does not shatter under American 8-inch fire. The walls stand. The structural integrity of the 19th century construction is not compromised in the catastrophic way that the garrison commanders had feared when the heavy artillery began. What the artillery does instead, what it does that the designer's calculation in 1902 did not fully account for, is accumulate. Every round that impacts the fort's exterior damages the ventilation system a little more. The fans and the ductwork that circulate air through the casemates and whose degradation converts the interior from a functional fighting space into an increasingly uncomfortable one, whose air quality the garrison cannot improve from inside the walls. Every round that impacts the fort's exterior damages the power systems and the communication systems that the German Army's 1940 improvements have added to the basic French fortification, the electrical generators whose operation provides the lighting that the casemates require for functional habitation, the telephone lines whose integrity connects the firing positions to the command post that coordinates the defense, the radio equipment whose maintenance in the impact-disturbed environment of a sustained artillery siege requires the spare parts that the encircled garrison cannot easily obtain. Every round that impacts the exterior raises the dust level inside the casemates, reduces the lighting when the power system degrades, creates the specific sensory environment of prolonged confinement under bombardment, the smell of cordite and concrete dust, the physical vibration of heavy rounds impacting overhead, the sound that the concrete transmits to the garrison's bodies even when it does not penetrate the garrisons. Protection, and contributes to the specific and cumulative degradation of the garrison's living and fighting conditions that the designer's 1902 calculation projected as sustainable for a siege of limited duration, but that the American artillery's capacity for indefinite continuation is converting into an open-ended attrition whose endpoint is not the fort's physical destruction, but the garrison's functional will. The fort's walls are standing in November 1944, their concrete intact, their earthen parapets unbreached. The garrisons inside them are not defeated by collapsed concrete. They are defeated by the sustained and inexhaustible American artillery that the designers never planned for, by the industrial capacity of a nation that can fire heavy artillery for 10 weeks without running out of rounds. November 18, 1944. General Kittel surrenders Metz to the Text Corps. The surrender comes 74 days after the 20 Corps' first contact with the city's outer defensive ring. 74 days that have been the longest siege of the European theater's autumn phase, during which the 20 Corps has fought through or around 17 major forts and dozens of smaller positions whose combined defensive value the German garrison has been exploiting with the professional competence of soldiers who knew their ground and who fought it well. Kittel has been wounded in the battle's final days, wounded in the fighting outside the fort's perimeter, in the infantry engagement that the encirclement's tightening has been producing as the American forces close on the fort's outer works, not inside the concrete casemate whose protection has been keeping him alive through the siege. He surrenders the city from a stretcher in the specific and documented circumstances of a commander whose defense has been as professional as the available resources and the situation's constraints permit, and whose conclusion has been determined not by the fall of the fort's walls, the walls are standing, but by the encirclement that the walls cannot prevent, and the artillery that the walls cannot stop. The remaining garrison soldiers who surrender with Kittel on November 18 are not men who have been beaten by the fort's failure. They are men who have been beaten by the persistence and the industrial capacity of the force that has been besieging them. Metz has held longer than any other major French city in the autumn 1944 campaign, a fact that is simultaneously a testament to the German garrison's professional competence and to the old fort's real, if limited, defensive capability. It is held from September 5 to November 18, 74 days, the longest siege of the European theater's autumn phase, longer than Saint-Malo, whose garrison surrendered after 3 weeks of American assault in August, longer than Brest, whose garrison under General Ramke held for 6 weeks before surrendering on September 18, longer than any of the Atlantic Wall fortress cities whose fortifications Eisenhower's commanders have been reducing since the Normandy breakout in late July. The 74-day defense has tied down a full American corps, Walker's 20th Corps, approximately 90,000 men, for the 10 weeks during which those men and that corps could have been applied elsewhere in the Allied advance toward the German border. The operational cost of Metz to the Allied campaign is real, and it is a cost that the forts made possible. They held because the old forts provided real defensive capability, whose underestimation by the Text Corps' initial planning produced the Fort Driant assault's failure and the subsequent revision of the American approach from direct assault to encirclement. They did not hold indefinitely, because the old fort's defensive capability is not adequate for the specific and indefinitely sustainable American artillery campaign that Walker's Corps has been prosecuting. The legacy of why German garrison commanders at Metz said American artillery made the old forts useless is a legacy that operates at the intersection of military history, architectural history, and the specific and irreducible fact of industrial capacity. The forts at Metz were not useless. This is the first and most important correction to the garrison commander's assessment, because the forts provided real and specific defensive value that is measurable in the 74 days that the Metz garrison held against an American corps whose operational commitment to reducing the city was substantial and sustained. The German garrison commanders who said American artillery made them useless were not wrong, but they were describing something more specific than the word useless captures. They were describing the gap between what the forts were designed to resist, the artillery siege of 1902, conducted by an army operating at 1902 ammunition production rates and 1902 logistical capacity, and what American artillery in 1944 can produce when supported by the industrial and logistical infrastructure of the American war economy at its 1944. The gap is not primarily a technological gap in the sense that the 8-inch howitzer represents a qualitatively different category of weapon from the siege artillery of 1902. The physics of a large artillery projectile hitting reinforced concrete are the same physics the 1902 designers were calculating against, and the concrete thicknesses they specified provide real protection against the impact energies involved. The gap is primarily a sustainment gap, and the sustainment gap is the gap that the designers could not have calculated because the inputs that determine sustainment, ammunition production rates, logistical capacity, the industrial output of the national economy supporting the siege, are not engineering constants that remain stable across 4 decades of technological and industrial development. The 1902 designers calculated the concrete thickness that would protect a garrison against an artillery siege of the duration that a siege army of 1902 could maintain, given the ammunition production rates and the logistical capacity of early 20th century military supply systems that would exhaust their heaviest ammunition in a siege of weeks, and that would be compelled to reduce their fire rates as the siege extended beyond the initial intensive phase. The American military in 1944 is not a siege army of 1902. Its ammunition production rates are not the rates of 1902. They are the rates of an industrial economy that has been converting its manufacturing capacity to war production since 1942 at the scale that America's GDP and industrial infrastructure permit. Its logistical capacity is not the capacity of 1902. It is the capacity of the Red Ball Express and the supply depots and the railway network that has been feeding the European theater's operations since the Normandy lodgment. The specific and documented assessment of the American 8-inch howitzer's supply situation during the Metz siege shows an artillery system that fires on the fort positions on 47 of the siege's 74 days, is limited on the remaining days not by ammunition shortage but by weather conditions that affect fire adjustment, and whose ammunition resupply is maintained at levels that prevent any period of sustained fire cessation. This is not what the 1902 designers were calculating for. They were calculating for a siege army that would run low on heavy ammunition, that would be compelled to conserve its heaviest rounds for critical moments, and whose siege would therefore have periods of reduced pressure during which the garrison could recover, repair, and resupply. The American artillery at Metz has no such periods. It does not run low. It does not conserve. It fires whenever the weather allows, on the schedule that the Corps' fire support coordination requires, sustained by the industrial supply chain that connects the firing batteries to the ammunition depots, to the production facilities, to the American economy, whose capacity for sustaining a modern artillery campaign the 1902 designers of Fort Driant did not and could not have included in their defensive calculation. General Kittle's assessment, preserved in the Foreign Military Studies interview that the American Army's historical program conducted after the war, is that the American artillery did not make the old forts useless in the sense of destroying them. It made them useless in the sense of making the duration of their resistance a function of the garrison's will rather than of the fort's structural integrity. And in a siege whose artillery has no practical ammunition limit, the garrison's will is the only variable that matters. And will, subjected to 74 days of sustained heavy artillery, has a finite supply that concrete and earthen revetment cannot replenish. The forts of Metz are still standing today, their 19th century concrete intact, their earthen parapets unbreached. What fell at Metz was not the walls. It was the gap between what the walls were designed to protect against and what they actually faced. And in that gap, between the military imagination of 1902 and the industrial reality of 1944, is a lesson about the relationship between defensive design and offensive capacity that every fortress engineer since Vauban has understood, and that the commanders inside Fort Driant learned again in the specific and personal terms of a garrison that survived the concrete but could not survive the arithmetic.